Hello everyone. In this video, the last of this series, I will show you how to solder the domes together to create our perfect sphere. To solder these two domes together, you can choose between two different methods. The first one is done in two stages. Start by sanding the edges slightly to expose a fresh layer of metal, and then bevel very slightly the outside edge of each dome using a scraper. The goal here is to create a channel to give the solder some space to run nicely around the sphere. Make sure you use only light pressure and drag the tool gently all around the edge. You only remove a small amount of metal. If we have a closer look, we see that we've only removed a tiny bit of metal on the outside edge. Now we're ready to assemble the sphere and to put the two domes together. They need to be secured with binding wire. To create more tension, we'll use a triple strand of binding wire that we twist at intervals. This will make it easier to get a tighter fit around the sphere and will prevent the domes from shifting while soldering. Tie the wire around the spheres, check that the domes are perfectly lined up. To prevent the wire from slipping, tie it around the poles of the sphere and use pliers to tighten it. And then cut the excess bit of wire. And finally, we need to check that the wire does not cover the hole for the air vent. Here it is. Now we are ready to solder, and this is how we need to set up our work for soldering. But first, let's make sure we do it safely. Some precautions. Make a small indentation in your brick or charcoal block to prevent the sphere from rolling off. And as an added precaution, place a third hand in front. Flux the seam and dry it lightly with the torch. And place bits of hard solder on your seam. Now, this takes a little while, so we'll speed up the video at this point. With this setup, only half the seam is exposed and accessible, so we'll solder this section first. Okay, we are done. Let's have a look. Check that there is enough solder, and we're ready to go. To get the solder to flow, we need to use a broad flame to heat up the entire object before directing the flame to the seam. The whole object needs to be warm before you can heat up the solder. So you go from side to side and to the base of the sphere to heat up the piece evenly. Both sides must be brought to the same temperature, otherwise the solder will not melt into the seam that will go to the warmest side of the object. When the entire piece is warm, direct your flame to the seam to get the solder to flow, and that's it. Let the piece air cool, do not pickle to avoid introducing moisture into the object. This would eventually damage the joint, which would break and the domes would separate. Before soldering the remaining section of the seam, remove the binding wire and sand the seam to remove the oxidation so it's clean and ready to be soldered. You can then flux the seam and then add hard solder And to solder, you will follow the same steps as before. This time we don't need binding wire because the two domes are already partly soldered and attached. So that's it for this first option. Now let's try the other method. This technique is called sweat soldering and is also done in 2 stages. We pre-melt the solder on one side for the first stage. First, place your domes on your bricks or charcoal block and flux the rim. Next, we are going to add solder, but this time we are going to put solder on one dome only. Place small pieces of hard solder on the rim of this dome. And this is a long process, so we'll speed up the video again. The pillions of solder, hard solder, are evenly spaced out on the edge, not touching one another. I prefer to use long skinny pieces of solder as opposed to big fat ones because it flows better. And you want just the right amount of solder. Too much and it's going to be messy. Too little, there will be gaps and this will be difficult to fix. So we are almost done. And we're going to look closely. And for the next step, we're going to melt the solder. And please take the same precautions, the same safety precautions as before. Heat up the entire dome, outside and inside, except the rim, until the pillions of solder start softening. When the solder softens, keep the flame on it until it melts just enough to stick to the rim. And then remove the heat quickly. The solder should not be too liquid. Pickle and rinse. And that's it, it's done. We are now ready for the second stage of this process. We are going to assemble the sphere and solder it together. Once pickled and dried, file the edge of the soldered dome very lightly, just to even out the lumps of solder. Next, flux the rim of the soldered dome and place the dome with the solder on the bottom and the other dome on top, making sure they are both perfectly lined up. Place a third hand on top of the assembly, applying light pressure to keep everything in place and facilitate soldering. Use a broad flame to heat up the entire piece and heat up both domes evenly until you see a bright line of solder move all around the sphere. All done. Now you can have a closer look and check the seam and make sure there is no gap. I think we are fine here. Now remember, as before, let cool and do not pickle. To clean, sand the excess solder on the seam and sand lightly the entire surface of the sphere to remove the oxidation. Do not polish, just leave the sanded finish. Alternatively, you can add a light texture if you want, and these are the options, or some of the options: a Scotch-Brite pad, or a steel wool, or a brass brush that you would use in your flex shaft. Have fun with your assignment, and thanks for watching.